I'm Bill Gates, chairman of Microsoft.
Text. Microsoft makes profits of about $1.5 billion per month.
Have you noticed that Microsoft has fallen out of the spotlight? Compared to their tech peers, Microsoft is rarely on the news, and not many people have a strong opinion about the company. In fact, I'd argue that Microsoft is the most prominent tech company that people don't have a strong opinion about. With Apple, there's the whole controversy about their premium pricing and their anti-user policies. With Facebook and Google, you've got the entire privacy argument. With Amazon, you've got the bald slave driver controversy. And with Netflix, well, a lot of people are happy that they're getting crushed. This isn't to say that we aren't dependent on Microsoft though. The vast majority of the world still uses Windows, and even if you're a Mac user, you probably still use Microsoft Office. Yet, despite their popularity, we rarely talk about Microsoft as a company. I mean, they're literally not even part of FAANG, and their public interest is virtually non-existent in comparison to FAANG. Despite this, Microsoft's business as a whole is doing better than ever. In fact, their gross margins are nearly 70%, and their net margins are nearly 40%. If Apple had these margins, people would be shredding them to pieces. But because it's Microsoft, no one cares or even knows other than shareholders. Last year, Microsoft even overtook Apple and became the world's most valuable company for a minute. If we saw this same thing happen with Amazon instead of Microsoft, we would have seen social media erupt with outrage and toxicity. Yet, no one cares because it was Microsoft. Somehow, they've essentially become the Visa of the tech space. Everyone knows about them and uses them on a regular basis, but no one cares about them much more than just that. Honestly, this is probably ideal, given that the spotlight hasn't exactly been forgiving historically. But how has the company that essentially created the modern computer experience been able to avoid the spotlight so effectively? Well, it's definitely not by accident. So here's how Microsoft became the world's largest background company. Taking a look back, Microsoft wasn't always such a discrete business. In the 80s and 90s, Microsoft was very much a consumer business, and that's why we all know about them today. As a front-facing company, they faced much of the same criticism that today's top tech companies are subject to. Many thought that Microsoft was a gross monopoly and that Bill Gates was a ruthless businessman. Bill's social image at the time could be compared to that of Mark Zuckerberg's today. But Bill didn't really care. He was the richest man in the world, and Microsoft was more profitable than ever. So he wasn't going to let some public criticism get to his head. But maybe he should have paid more attention to the criticism, because pretty soon regulators got involved. In 1992, the Federal Trade Commission would begin an inquiry into Microsoft's monopoly. This quickly escalated into a DOJ investigation, and in 1994, the DOJ would order that Microsoft was no longer allowed to package other Microsoft products with the sale of Windows. However, one nuance to this decree was that Microsoft could continue packaging in additional features with Windows. It probably would have been in Microsoft's best interest to play this safe and avoid testing the regulators, but Microsoft had different plans. The internet was starting to explode in popularity, and it was clear to Microsoft that the internet was the next big thing. So what better way to capitalize on the internet than to launch a browser? And this led to the creation of Internet Explorer in 1995. If Microsoft stopped right there, it wouldn't have been that bad. Sure, they were still pushing the boundaries of being a computer software monopoly, but they weren't violating any court decrees, right? Well, this was true at the beginning, but this didn't last long. It was clear to Microsoft that if they really wanted to make Internet Explorer popular, they had to package it with Windows. So they would call Internet Explorer a feature and throw it in with Windows. As you would guess, regulators weren't exactly a fan of this classification. Internet Explorer was obviously a product, and Microsoft was simply calling it a feature to try to get around the DOJ settlement. At first, the regulators turned a blind eye to this, but Microsoft kept pushing the envelope. Remember the controversy about Apple slowing down older iPhones? Well, Microsoft had their own version of this with Internet Explorer. They told users and the court that if the browser was uninstalled, Windows would run slower and have more malfunctions. This was obviously completely false. And if Windows did slow down, it was because Microsoft programmed it to slow down, not because Internet Explorer actually made Windows run better. Eventually, regulators had enough, and in 1998, they would put their foot down. The DOJ and the Attorney Generals of 20 US states and the District of Columbia would sue Microsoft for illegally thwarting competition in order to protect and extend its software monopoly. Usually, it takes forever for regulators to get involved, but once they're involved, you know they mean business. Two perfect examples of this were Standard Oil and AT&T. In 1911, Standard Oil was broken up into 34 different companies, and in 1984, AT&T was split up into 8 different companies. A breakup like this would have devastated Microsoft, and Bill knew it. Fortunately for Microsoft though, Bill had already been preparing to fight such a lawsuit. You see, several months before the lawsuit, Microsoft had actually bailed out Apple. If you're familiar with Apple's history, you would know that they were getting destroyed in the late 1990s, and the company was on the brink of bankruptcy. Even though Microsoft could have easily watched from the sidelines as Apple went bankrupt, Bill decided to strike a deal with Steve instead. Steve agreed to drop Apple's copyright lawsuit against Microsoft, and Bill agreed to invest $150 million into Apple. Through this deal, not only was Bill able to knock out Apple's lawsuit against them, but he was able to create some plausible deniability for himself. If regulators questioned him about monopolistic practices, Bill could point to how he saved Apple and how he's actually pro-competition. Unfortunately though, regulators didn't quite buy Bill's master plan. And on June 7, 2000, they ordered that Microsoft be broken up into 2 separate units. One unit would produce operating systems, while the other would produce additional software. Honestly, this ruling wasn't even that bad, given that AT&T was broken up into 8 parts and Standard Oil was broken up into 34 parts. But that doesn't mean that Microsoft was happy with the verdict. They definitely were not gonna go down without a fight, so they filed an appeal. The appeal was instantly escalated to the Supreme Court, and the justices would surprisingly all side with Microsoft, but not for the reason that you would think. The Supreme Court unanimously agreed that Microsoft was absolutely a monopoly. However, they invalidated the breakup order because the judge who issued the order did not follow the correct protocols. He had failed to hold hearings on a remedy, and he had also been having secret interviews with reporters while the case was ongoing. The Supreme Court did not rule out the possibility of properly issuing another breakup order. But after being so publicly humiliated, it's no wonder why prosecutors did not pursue another breakup order. Instead, they would order that Microsoft share their application programming interface with third-party companies, and that a panel be set up to ensure Microsoft's compliance. Microsoft had basically just won the lottery. They were able to avoid a game-changing breakup, all thanks to a few semantics. Playing ball as a brash public monopoly had nearly devastated Microsoft, and Microsoft had escaped with the skin of their teeth. There was no way that Steve Ballmer or Bill were gonna let this happen to Microsoft again. And this marked the beginning of Microsoft's life in a shell. There was no question that Microsoft needed to stop attracting all of this public interest if they wanted to avoid future lawsuits and regulations. But how does such a massive company fade from the spotlight? Well, the answer is switching customers. Microsoft has always had an extremely loose policy when it comes to people pirating their software. In fact, Bill has publicly admitted that Microsoft would rather you use a pirated version of their software than a pirated or paid version of someone else's software.
People don't pay for the software. They will, though. It's sort of as long as they're going to steal it, we want them to steal ours. They sort of get addicted, and then we somehow figure out how to collect sometime in the next decade. So it's a great place to be involved.
As you can see, Bill was very much okay with people pirating their software if it meant that Microsoft would get more market share. As Bill touched on, the idea was that they could eventually figure out some sort of method of monetization, whether that be ads or data collection. By the mid-2000s, Windows and Office had basically reached market saturation, so it was finally time to collect. But they couldn't deploy something as public as ads or data collection. Regulators were literally waiting for the next moment that Microsoft would trip up so that they could pursue more severe legal action. So directly monetizing customers was off the table. But maybe it was time to look at monetization differently. Instead of trying to monetize the end user directly, maybe it was smarter to monetize businesses. They had already gotten people used to it and addicted to Microsoft products. So they could force businesses, institutions, and computer manufacturers to pay for Windows and Office. They also went ahead and basically made Windows free for end users, so no one could really complain. Everyday people weren't directly paying Microsoft at all. And institutions had better things to do than complain about Microsoft leveraging their monopoly and charging insane markups. I gotta say, there was a legitimate reason to complain if they wanted to though. Back in 2010, Microsoft literally had gross margins above 80%. But the regulators didn't really care because they only cared about protecting the public, not institutions. They figured that institutions have the resources and the capital to protect themselves if they wanted to. And given that the public wasn't being harmed, regulators turned a blind eye once again. Not to mention, they had bigger fish to fry like Facebook, Google, and Amazon who were even more obvious monopolies. So Microsoft has been more or less left to do as they please when it comes to the computer OS market. Over time, Microsoft has further leaned into this B2B model, and they've started to offer these businesses other products like servers and cloud computing. Since then, this side business has grown so much that it's actually started to outshine Windows and Office. In fact, Intelligent Cloud is now Microsoft's largest revenue driver, having pulled in $20.9 billion last quarter. This includes all of their server products and cloud services. Second place goes to the productivity and business processes category, which pulled in $16.6 billion. This includes Microsoft Office, LinkedIn, and other commercial products. And in last place, we have the personal computing category, which pulled in $14.4 billion. And this is what includes Windows, the Xbox, Bing, and other consumer products. This means that Microsoft could completely ditch the consumer market, and their business would only shrink 30%, if that. In other words, they could ditch the consumer market, and they'd likely still be a trillion-dollar company. And that right there is why Microsoft has completely avoided the spotlight. In the 80s and 90s, Microsoft was one of the most well-known consumer businesses in the world. But after nearly being broken up, they made a 180. They pivoted to being an institutional business, which allowed them to maintain their monopoly with little public criticism and legal ramifications. And now that they've made the switch, they no longer need or want public attention. For them, it's better if the media keeps grilling on Facebook and Google, while Microsoft continues making just as much from the background. And that's why Microsoft has been avoiding the spotlight. Did you realize what game Microsoft was playing? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you can't help but respect the strategy. And of course, consider checking out our Discord community to suggest future video ideas and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.